The 4th of June 1989 has always been the most feared date for the Chinese authorities. Peaceful rallies at Tiananmen Square demanding political reform ended with thousands shot dead by the military on the 4th of June. It became the country's biggest taboo for decades. Anyone who even alludes to it using coded language, such as the 35th of May, a row of ducks, or a banana lined up against 4 apples, now gets caught by AI and lands in serious trouble. The strange part is that in the regime's own history, far worse man-made disasters are safer to discuss. This year, during the 60th anniversary of the Cultural Revolution, causing tens of millions of lives, uncensored articles, books, and films about it circulate widely on Chinese social media. It's a glaring contrast with the total ban of the 4th of June. And it holds even now. In the middle of the China magazine fever, the trendy China tours, the skyscrapers, the high-speed rail, the EVs, all of that ostensibly validates the regime's legitimacy, and it still lacks the confidence to tolerate even a single date on the calendar. So why is that one date uniquely untouchable when bloodier history is allowed to be remembered? And how did erasing it quietly define the modern China I lived in for 3 decades? That confusion sent me down a rabbit hole into the mindset behind the taboo. First, what actually happened? The 1989 pro-democracy movement began in April after the death of the open-minded leader Hu Yaobang. Thousands of well-educated students and citizens filled Beijing's Central Square, calling for civic participation, a free press, political reform, and end to corruption and inflation. Then on the 26th of April, the most powerful media outlet at the time, People's Daily, ran an editorial branding the peaceful rallies as thuggery and rioting. With no free press to push back, the destructive smear couldn't be answered by any public debate, so the students answered it themselves on the street. The next day, the number in Beijing jumped to roughly 200,000, now demanding the movement be exonerated. Millions of ordinary passers-by backed them. The movement spread to other cities fast, before the government declared martial law. On the night of the 3rd into the 4th of June, on Deng Xiaoping's instruction, the troops and the tanks moved in. Thousands of unarmed protesters and bystanders were shot dead in the areas surrounding the square. The next day, one citizen stood alone in front of a column of tanks. It became one of the defining images of the century. The officers who refused to fire on citizens and the state media staff who reported it honestly were purged. Intellectuals who wrote about it were exiled, including Gao Xingjian, the first writer to win the Nobel Prize for work in Chinese. Scholars who stood with the students and chose to stay accepted prison. Among them Liu Xiaobo, the only Nobel Peace Laureate in history to die in custody without ever holding his award. Today, the erasure reaches its grimest form in how the regime treats the Tiananmen mothers, women who lost their children to the army that night and gathered to demand accountability. Every year, in the week around the 4th of June, the authorities force them out of Beijing and ship them to other cities to block any commemoration or contact with journalists. The same tactic hits dissidents, petitioners, and human rights lawyers ahead of the date. These rules run through every Chinese app you can name: DeepSeek, Genshin Impact, Temu, Rednote, WeChat, all of them filtering the terms automatically. Even Western travel sites now warn tourists not to raise the date with their guide because they can wreck the guide's career. This is how the regime erases a day from the calendar, and for a whole generation, it works. The memory just dims. Then the erasure entered a stage so absurd, it's almost fiction. Take Li Jiaqi, once the most dominant live streamer in China, who generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually by selling products in streams. In June 2022, on the eve of the Tiananmen anniversary, a guest on his stream showed him an ice cream cake shaped like a tank. He was delighted by it and had absolutely no idea what it meant. The stream was cut immediately. Overnight, he was wiped from the entire internet and disappeared without a word of explanation. Although his account came back months later, his traffic and brand deals collapsed. It demonstrated a new level of absurdity. In China, you're not only forbidden to be aware of the taboo, you're also forbidden to be unaware of it if you want to keep your business. But what struck me the most is that, as the date became non-existent in mainland China, every forgotten story about it was being translated and preserved with remarkable care in Hong Kong. At the height of the movement in May 1989, hundreds of the biggest stars of the cinephone world gathered in Hong Kong for a vast concert in support of the students in Beijing. After the massacre, Hong Kong became the one place on earth that held a mass vigil for the victims every single year. Jimmy Lai's Apple Daily chased the truth, and even traced the whereabouts of Tankman. Reporters at outlets like Stan News kept the Tiananmen mothers visible while Beijing tried to disappear them. And when 2 million people took to the streets in 2019 to defend exactly this kind of freedom of expression, it was no accident that it landed on the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen. The protesters even opened orderly corridors for ambulances through the crowds, a direct salute to the students who'd done the same in 1989. Then came the crackdown. Thousands jailed for what amounts to thought crime. Zhou Hongtong, who organized the annual vigils and spoke up for persecuted rights defenders on the mainland. Gwyneth Hall, who reported the Tiananmen mother's story. They all chose to stay in their home city and face imprisonment. And those forced out of Hong Kong continued to carry the stories to the world. The award-winning play, May 35th, named for the coded date, follows a dying Tiananmen mother whose last wish is simply to hold a proper ritual for her murdered son, against an official's constant obstruction. No piece of theatre has ever moved me to tears for longer. These stories also drove me to speak out. As a composer, I released my first Mandarin song outside China's Great Firewall in 2023, with lyrics carrying the 4th of June stories that are erased inside the country. Then the police contacted my family in China, and the Ministry of State Security issued a warning demanding that I stop. This is why, despite its horror, China is still portrayed as an Orwellian state, resembling many scenes from the novel 1984. The labyrinth of coded language is newspeak. The total erasure of the date is a memory hole. Mass surveillance and mandatory self-censorship mirror the chilling effect of thought crime. And the demand that you be both unaware and aware of a taboo at once is a striking real-world doublethink. So how does this Orwellian reality reconcile with the technologically advanced country we see today? What is the origin of that erased date, which could explain this contradiction? There's a fashionable theory that China is an engineering state, that its rise came from technocrats pouring everything into STEM and industrialization, insulated from the censorship aimed at the messy humanities, unlike America's loyalty state and its endless debates. I half agree with it, but it oversimplifies. If we trace the Tiananmen movement back to China's opening up, we see the whole sentiment was conceived entirely from the fields of STEM in the first place. After Mao's destruction of meritocracy was ended by a coup in 1976, Deng Xiaoping restored order by opening to the outside world and rebuilding a fiercely competitive education system aimed at science and engineering, the fields he judged most urgent for pulling China out of poverty. But by the mid-1980s, economic reform under an autocratic system had opened a huge gap between meritocratic promise and reality. The dual-track price system let well-connected officials and their families profiteer, epitomized by firms directly tied to Deng's own family. Princelings and cadre children got the business licenses and the good job postings. For the top STEM students who'd won their place through the brutal Gaokao exam, this was a direct betrayal. They had studied 15 hours a day to play the system's game, and found the top rungs were handed out by power, not talent. At that time, a prominent physicist stood out to teach the students how to speak it out loud. In 1986, the vice president of the University of Science and Technology of China, Fang Lizhi, became a hugely popular interdisciplinary lecturer by touring campuses. He told the story of Galileo, persecuted by the church for telling the scientific truth, and rehabilitated by the Vatican only in the 1970s. He saw a parallel in his own life. His Big Bang research had been branded heresy by the party for clashing with Marxist doctrine, until his own vindication in the 70s. His message was that truth answers to evidence and conscience, not to any authority. So freedom and rights aren't privileges handed down from above. They are innate, and people have to think for themselves and actively claim them. He gave precise language to the unfairness those science and engineering students already felt. As a foundational figure in China's engineering rise, Fang Lizhi founded China's first astrophysics lab. That academic authority, fused with political literacy, lit the fuse for mass student rallies across the country for political reform as early as 1986. It became the symbolic run-up that eventually made 1989 possible. So after the crackdown, Fang was branded the mastermind behind the whole movement. Placed among the most wanted, he was forced into exile. Then as a tenured professor at the University of Arizona, he kept up both his physics and his humanitarian work. He supported and elevated many intellectuals who were being punished in China, but had very little visibility there. This is the scientific origin of that date. And it proves untenable to say that China built its engineering state by sealing itself off from the humanities. The tension between engineering minds and humanist critical thinking ran through China's rapid development. And by the way, I made a full video on how that tension shaped China's tech advancement in detail. You can watch it here. So the regime fearing the power of a scientist's words is in a sense understandable. But why build a machine this complex and this absurd around one particular date and not the others? I want to go deeper into what the party was doing behind the curtain. The hardliners around Deng did respect the scientific field. What they could not tolerate was the interdisciplinary energy bursting out of it, the moment those students and scholars looked capable of challenging the party's hard-won power. In a secret meeting in Beijing with the US National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft, days after the crackdown, Deng made his logic plain. He suggested that the party had won the country through a 22-year war that cost more than 20 million lives, and anyone challenging its rule had better be ready to pay a comparable price. Well, that framing is badly flawed. By his own count, 2/3 of those 22 years were actually civil wars driven by the party's own ideology, not the just wars against imperialism it claimed. And I will make a dedicated video talking about it in the future. There was also a huge loss of face. The students occupying the square humiliated Deng during his May summit with Soviet leader Gorbachev. The meeting was meant to formally end the 30-year Sino-Soviet split, the most historic moment of his late career. Yet with the square occupied, Gorbachev had to be sneaked into the Great Hall of the People through back doors. Together, these were the direct triggers of the decision to clear the square by force. That being said, following the massacre that shocked the world, international sanctions and economic backlash forced Deng into tactical concessions. Firstly, he reformed the economy harder because the majority of the movement's anger was from working-class concerns about the economy. He loosened the rigid socialist ideology, opening to the free market and foreign investment. Then the ground shifted again. The communist systems of Eastern Europe collapsed, and Soviet Union followed soon after Tiananmen. That chain reaction made Deng nervous. And by coincidence, the World Wide Web was invented in 1989. Deng understood the double edge immediately. Information technology could cement his legitimacy or damage it, exactly like the movement led by science students. So through the 1990s, he built the largest censorship infrastructure ever attempted, alongside all his other engineering megaprojects. Which means that from the very birth of the internet in China, the apparatus existed first to bury one thing, the discussion of the 4th of June. That's almost certainly why this single date has always sat at the very top of the sensitivity hierarchy. But survival instinct alone doesn't explain the strangest part, that the regime's worst atrocities like the Cultural Revolution stay discussable, while punishment for discussing the 4th of June has only grown harsher under Xi Jinping. Some notes from a senior party meeting in late 1989 could potentially explain the deeper psychology behind it. When justifying shooting the students, Deng Xiaoping genuinely believed he was doing good deeds by putting down a second cultural revolution. As a living victim of those 10 years of terror, Deng could not tolerate what looked to him like the mob returning. Again, he totally got it wrong. The Cultural Revolution had been ill-informed violent mobs weaponized by Mao's rule of terror to tear every institution down, whereas the 1989 rallies were the opposite. Peaceful, value-driven, and led by a well-educated public a decade into China's opening to the world. They aimed to solve the very conditions that had triggered the Cultural Revolution. Unfortunately, Deng saw a copy of his worst memory and wrongfully projected his fear onto the innocent people, under the same old mindset inherited from Mao. But the consequence outlived the man and his fear. The machine built to bury one date eventually became the operating system for everything else. At first glance, erasing a massacre defines modern China from the top down, a state that puts stability above everything. But that's not how the 4th of June uniquely defines the lives of ordinary Chinese citizens today. The bottom-up version of modern China is defined by what almost happened in the wake of 1989. Because hidden behind the tanks and the censorship are some questions the party can never comfortably answer. What if the students were right? What if the scientists, writers, journalists, and professionals who keep speaking, even at the risk of jail, had identified a genuine flaw in the system? What if political accountability, a freer press, and intellectual independence were never threats to China's rise, but necessary ingredients of it? That possibility can deconstruct the regime's deeply flawed understanding of stability. Because once people start asking those questions, they reach an unavoidable conclusion. Ordinary citizens in China achieved incredible things despite the illiberal system, not because of it. And from there, they start imagining a different modern China, a society where talent mattered more than connections to central power, a free market of ideas where criticism was treated as feedback, not as a threat to the cadres and princelings' vast transnational wealth, a just system where intellectuals exposing forced labor were not exiled for saying so, a free academic culture where loyalty to the truth outranked an ideology that depends on keeping past sins buried. So this is how a single erased date defined modern China. Every year, the party spends enormous resources making sure one date never appears. Every year, people find new ways to remember it anyway. The harder the system works to manufacture amnesia, the more clearly its citizens see what the date was always pointing to. The imagination of a more civilized China, and the proof that they were right to want it. If there's one thread running under this whole story, it's that the people who created and sustained the stories from the 4th of June were the ones who believe in merit most, the exam winners who discovered the game was rigged at the top. That exam-oriented education system became the engine that produced the economic miracle and the cage that traps merit. I made a full video on that system. Watch it next. Thank you for watching. Stay well.